Did you receive your MCAS score and you're wondering what sort of schools you should be applying to? Are you not sure of the schools you should be applying to and not applying to? Well, you came to the right place. Alright, so here are my 14 tips on how to make a great school list for your medical school application. So my first tip is to make sure you have the right mindset. So I think the mindset you should be having is that you want to get into a medical school, not the medical school. Let me say that again. You want to get into a medical school rather than the medical school. And the reason why I said this, or the reason why I say this, is because medical school is pretty competitive to get in, and basically each year or each application process, only around 40% of applicants get into at least one school. This means that 60% of applicants do not get to any school, and most of the medical school acceptance rates are well below 10%. So compare that to college admissions, medical school admissions is much more competitive. In addition, it costs a lot of money. So there's primary costs, secondary costs, interviews. And now with schools going back to in-person interviews, that's gonna make the application process even more expensive. And for me, I would rather apply once than be very risky and basically not being ready at all. So you want to make sure to only do this once, because again, the application process is very expensive and you don't want to go to multiple application processes for no reason. And I personally think it's better to be a little bit more conservative than too risky, because you want to make sure, again, you want to get into one medical school or at least one medical school. Now, I'm not saying you can shoot your shot at some of the schools. I think that's not a bad idea, but you want to make sure that you have a balanced list so that you don't have to apply more than once. Now, my second tip is to apply broadly. So what I mean by this is you want to be able to apply to multiple regions of the United States. So for example, if you're from the East Coast, you don't want to just apply to East Coast medical schools. You want to also apply to schools that's in the South Coast, the West Coast, and the Midwest. And of course, I understand that you want to be in an ideal location for yourself, but again, medical school is very competitive, so I would suggest at least applying to a few regions that are not from your region that you're originally living or that you currently live in right now. And so with this, some regions are going to be more competitive than others. So for example, the East and West Coast are more competitive because, let's be honest, I think a lot of people would rather want to live there, while regions of the South and Midwest tend to be less competitive because not much people want to live there. So I would just say to apply to multiple regions of medical schools and don't restrict yourself to one region. Alright, I would say my third tip is to have a mix of undershoot, target, and reach schools. Now, what I mean by this is that usually schools are gonna have different average stats depending on how competitive the school is, as well as the resources they provide or the connections they have. So your undershoot schools are schools that are below your stats, while your target schools are gonna be within your stats, and then finally your reach schools are gonna be schools that are higher than your stats. And so your school should be mostly target schools with a few undershoot schools and a few reach schools. Now again, you could shoot the stars and apply to a few reach schools that you like, or apply to schools that you always dreamed of, but definitely do not make your list too top heavy, because those schools are all to be very competitive and most people, even with higher stats, do not get in. So you want to make sure that you give yourself that balance of schools, with the majority of schools being target schools. And just to even be more safe, if you feel like you want to be more conservative, then I would apply to a similar amount of undershoot schools and target schools, so that you give yourself that very good chance of getting into at least one medical school. And so yes, it's not a bad deal to have a few undershoot schools, as they're going to ultimately provide the same education as mid-tier and top-tier schools. Now, my fourth tip is to avoid too many low yield schools. Alright, so the definition of low yield schools are basically when more than 10,000 applicants apply to that school in a specific application cycle. So as you imagine, that is a lot of people. So it's okay to have a few schools that are low yield schools, but don't have too many because these are also really competitive. And again, most of the time it's competitive due to the location of that school. And in addition, the reason why they're competitive as well but basically the median stats of the medical school are pretty average stats. So it makes it feel like that most applicants have a shot of getting into that school, which is the opposite because of how much people are actually applying to the school. And I'd say with this, if you apply to a decent amount of low yield schools or even a few low yield schools, you want to be able to apply to those schools within, or basically you want to apply to those schools that resonates with your mission, and hopefully it can connect to their mission and their fit. So basically you want to apply to schools that you can have that connection with their mission. Alright, so my next tip is to check each school's websites for their application requirements. Now this is mostly pertaining to the GPA and the MCAT score, and some schools will have a minimum GPA and a minimum MCAT in order to actually be competitive for the application cycle. Now this is a bit tricky, especially for people who have maybe lower stats, because you want to obviously make sure that you're not wasting money right away. So you want to be able to definitely check that. And basically the key thing is to make sure you meet their strict cutoff so that you're not wasting any money. Now if you're not sure of the cutoff, or perhaps if the cutoff is not showing, then I'll definitely give them a call or an email, and they might be able to clarify that. And that is a good way to also filter out schools that you don't want to apply to anymore because maybe you didn't meet the cutoff or something like that. Now there are also schools that has certain elective requirements. Usually these elective requirements are more upper level science classes, and some of these might be classes that perhaps you didn't take. So there's a school in Arizona, I think it's called the University of Phoenix, Arizona, and they had a specific requirement and that you have to get this certain grade in this specific course that most people who applied to medical school didn't take. So this was unusual. I was like, whoa, okay. And from there I just removed the school because I didn't meet that requirement. And I would say mainly just check the course for those electives, because usually your prereqs, I think everyone should be taking those courses because those are your prereqs to actually apply to medical school. So there are some schools that really emphasize community service. Some schools might even mention the recommended amount of hours they require, but usually you can tell that a school really emphasizes community service by the mission statement. And this is why I say it's very important to check the mission statement so that you're able to know whether to apply it or not. Basically for these schools that really emphasize community service, I will say if you don't have those hours or don't have a good amount of hours, then I will definitely avoid applying to those type of schools as well. Alright, my next tip is definitely to apply to schools based on narrative and fit. Now I think your narrative and your activities should resonate with the mission statements of the other schools. This calls for clearly a background as well. I think all three of these components, such as your background, your narrative, and your activities, should be able to resonate with the school's mission statement. For example, if you want to apply to schools that really emphasize underserved areas or serving underserved areas, and you don't have any experience with that in your application, then I will avoid applying to that school. And in addition, you can also check out the activities that the school has to see whether you can see yourself doing those activities in that medical school. That can also be a good way to see and determine whether you actually fit with that school. And lastly, I will also check some other factors when it comes to specific schools, such as location, lecture attendance, MBME exams, board scores, activities, grading, etc. Alright, my next tip is to avoid applying to out-of-state schools that have a very low matriculation rate for out-of-state students. So the only reason why I apply to out-of-state schools that have a lower or very low matriculation rate is if I had very strong ties with that state. So usually the percentage that is pretty low is anything under 20%. So those schools I would definitely avoid applying to, unless again if you have very strong ties. This could be that you went to maybe the high school in that state, or it could be perhaps that you had extended family and you often travel there from time to time, stuff like that. Now I would say anything or anywhere between 20-30% is okay. It's still on the lower side, so I still only apply to a few, but they're generally okay. But with those type of schools, you want to make sure you definitely have some type of ties to the state to enhance your chances of getting into those type of schools. And I will say anything above 30% is pretty safe to apply to, so take that as a rule. Usually the out-of-state schools that have a very low matriculation rate for applicants are public schools. Alright, my next tip is to definitely apply to all your in-state schools. The reason why I say to apply to all your in-state schools is usually there are less applicants that apply to those schools, and also they're gonna most likely provide more interview spots, so you have an increased chance of getting into those schools. And usually the incentive with those in-state public schools is that schools gonna want their students to stay in that state or at least within the area, as you know, the purpose is to eventually practice it later, whether as residents or even as attending physicians. Alright, my next tip is to consider applying to US DO schools. Now DO schools stands for osteopathic medical schools, and I would consider definitely applying to these either if your stats are the highest or if you already applied to a cycle once already. So usually I would say if you have either less than a 3.7 and or less than a 510 MCAT score, then I would say maybe consider applying to at least one DO school. Again, this could be different for everyone, so just reflect on your experiences and your overall application before considering applying to a DO school. You could also just talk to different advisors or talk to current medical students and sort of have that mentor session to see whether you should be applying to DO schools. But the one thing I will say is that only apply to them if you actually are interested in attending one, because there could be an instance if you don't get accepted to any MD schools and you receive acceptance to one DO school, and then if you turn down that acceptance, then that's going to look really bad on you, because usually on most applications they will say, oh, they applied to medical school before, they get even received acceptance before, and you have to say yes and then explain your situation. So I'll definitely say only apply to DO schools if you actually want to attend one. Alright, my next thing is to consider applying to TMD SCS schools if you either have very strong ties to Texas or if you're actually an in-state resident of Texas. And with being out of state, if you want to apply to these TMD SCS schools, you also want to make sure you have high stats in addition to having that fit and having those ties to Texas. Now the reason why they're so popular to apply to is that they're very cheap and they provide a good and quality education, and like I said before, they're very competitive. And the reason why they're competitive is because they have this rule where basically these Texas medical schools are going to have to accept 90% of the in-state applicants, so that only leaves 10% for the out-of-state applicants, and most of these applicants are already pretty strong. Now this next tip, it might come as a controversial, but speaking with multiple medical students and just read up different facts, I think that this next tip is a good tip. And the next tip is to avoid applying to Caribbean medical schools. Now the reason why I say to avoid applying to Caribbean schools is they usually have much lower match rates than US MD schools and US DO schools, and when you have a lower match rate, it's going to be harder to get to a residency program. And it's really pretty hard to get to any residency program, especially the competitive residency programs that are non-primary care. So with being a Caribbean MD student, it's going to be even harder to get into those competitive programs. Also, for what I heard and when I talk to current medical students that go to Caribbean schools, it's usually much harder because they don't give you as much support. And a good example is sometimes, or not even sometimes, but in exams, usually if you fail once, you might not be able to try again, and you're gonna get kicked out. And the problem is with medical school, most students are taking on loans, and if you get kicked out to medical school, you have to pay those loans right back, even though you didn't even finish your school, and of course even though you didn't even gain the title of becoming a practicing and licensing physician. And so even when those students that actually make it, they make it to step 1, step 2 CK, and they're able to apply to residency programs. You're pretty much gonna be left with the residency programs that not that many MD and DO students apply to. And I would say this should be used as a very last resort if you took the MCAT several times and didn't score well, or if you have a very non-traditional story of getting into medicine. But even though I think, in my opinion, is much better to take that time you need, whether that's gap years and doing post-bac or studying for MCAT or gaining more clinical experiences to get into USDO or MD school. Alright, my next tip is to be wary of newer medical schools. And when I'm talking about newer medical schools, I mean schools that are on pre-accreditation. And the reason why is because usually schools are on pre-accreditation, they are mostly not going to offer any federal loans. And remember I said about federal loans, where most students have to use that resort to actually pay off medical school. And in addition, there's no proof of class performance, so you don't even know what the average board scores are, or you don't even know how the grading works. So you're kind of not really too sure what the grading looks like, and that might affect how well or how bad you do in medical school. And basically it could be used as an experiment because this is the first time testing out the curriculum. This is the first time, seeing whether this curriculum could work with students and doing good for step 1 and step 2 CK. And so with this, I'll apply to school of interest that interests you, but I will still keep it to a very, very bare minimum. And especially if you have multiple acceptances, I will consider your other acceptances before choosing a school that is newer. Alright, my next tip is to apply to fee assistant programs for the AMC and for COMAS. And if there's a TMD SES as fee assistant program, you should also apply to that as well. Again, I'm not too sure about TMD SES, so you have to do research on that, but I know for the two I mentioned before, there are some type of fee assistant program or waiver. And the reason I say this is that you save a lot of money. So I know for the AMC, you get 20 free schools to apply to, as well as all your secondary essays waived, or basically all your causes of secondaries waived. I know for a COMAS, I believe there's a discount of the COMAS fee waiver, and you also get all your secondaries waived from the school as well. Now, let's say if you didn't get approved for the AMC or the COMAS one and you got approved for the other one. You can try email admissions and talk about how you got waived of one application process, and then perhaps ask them if you can get their secondary waived. Sometimes some schools might allow you to submit proof of your AMC fee waiver for a COMAS school, and that actually might work so that you have to pay a secondary for the COMAS school. And I'm sure you could do this the other way, where you can apply to AMC school and you need to get accepted to the AMC fee waiver, and you can use the COMAS information to email admissions and show them proof that you actually did it, or that you actually got waived by fee waiver, and it might allow you to not pay that secondary at all. Alright, my last tip is to definitely make a spreadsheet for organization of your application. And I'll say this is a very important tip too, because you can keep track of your primaries, you can keep track of every school you apply to, you can keep track of the target, reach, and understreet schools you apply to, and you can also keep track of the secondaries you submit to these schools. And that's going to be pretty important for another video that I make on how to do well in secondary essays. In addition, you can even put notes of the specific schools so that you know how to compare these schools to one another, because maybe at the end of the day you might need to make the decision between a few schools, and you want to be able to have notes so that you're able to know, okay, this school I got accepted to and stuff like that. And one thing I will do is, especially if you bought MSAR, which is basically where you can see every AMC school, you can also do the same thing with DO Explorer, which is for the DO schools, is that you should make notes of the specific schools so that basically once that subscription expires, you still have those access to those notes instead of trying to buy one again, which obviously is a waste of money. So I wouldn't do that. Alright, that is the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed, definitely give this video a thumbs up, and as well comment down below what type of videos you want to see next. So my plan definitely is to continue making this series, so I'm probably going to talk about secondaries maybe sometime next month or early July, and then I'm going to also talk about interviews, and of course I'm going to talk about my application process as soon as I'm done waiting for other schools. Yes, I'm still on the wait list to a few other schools, so I'm just waiting for those, and then I'll make my application process. But no, thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.